Hey, what's up? Welcome back to your channel name. This time, we're going to dive into a story that will make you think twice before walking alone at night. Grab some snacks, turn off the lights, and listen closely. Autumn had just begun when Margaret Hensley set foot once again in her homeland, clutching the hand of her 10-year-old son, Ellis. After losing her husband in a tragic car accident 2 years prior in Birmingham, life in their cramped London flat had become suffocating, both physically and emotionally. So, when the letter arrived, informing her she had inherited her late grandmother's house, Margaret saw it as a lifeline. The house had stood abandoned for years, its reputation in the neighborhood long forgotten by time but still whispered about by those who remembered. Wycliffe Hollow, as the locals once called it, stood at the edge of a sleepy road that rarely saw traffic. The house itself looked as though it had been carved out of an older, darker England, complete with its steep, moss-covered roof, narrow windows, and tall stone chimneys that reached into the fog like skeletal arms. No one had lived there in decades. Ivy choked the walls. The garden was more wild than tended. But to Margaret, it was a sanctuary. A place to rebuild. Yet the moment she turned the key and pushed open the door, she felt a subtle but unmistakable resistance, as though the house itself hesitated to let her in. Cold air rushed out to meet her, despite the early afternoon sun. The floors groaned underfoot with every step. The wallpaper hung in strips. The scent of age was thick in the air, damp and earthy, like something long buried. But she pushed those feelings aside. This was her new beginning. Encircling the house was a rusting wrought iron fence, its paint chipped and flaking, revealing the oxidized red underneath. The spikes at the top were bent in odd angles, as though they had once served a purpose more sinister than just decoration. Near the entrance, an old wooden sign hung askew, its lettering almost worn away. Only when the afternoon sun hit it just right could one make out the faded words, Wycliffe Hollow. The path leading up to the front steps was laid with rounded stones, slick with moss and thyme. Each footfall felt like stepping into something sacred, or profane. Towering above the house were ancient oak trees, their branches gnarled like arthritic fingers. They leaned inward, as though whispering secrets to each other when no one was watching. Leaves scattered the ground, though none seemed to fall. No birds sang in their canopy. No squirrels ran across their limbs. Only silence and the slow, creaking whistle of the wind passing through. Ellis clung tightly to his mother's hand as they passed beneath one of the larger trees. Its shadow stretched farther than it should have, casting a strange shape against the house's crumbling facade. The iron gate creaked slowly as it closed behind them, as if the house had exhaled, welcoming them, or perhaps sealing them in. Ellis was not like most boys his age. While others filled their days with noisy games and cartoons, Ellis preferred solitude, old books, and drawings of strange, angular shapes no one else understood. He had always been quiet, but after his father's death, something in him closed off even more. He stopped laughing. He stopped asking questions. Instead, he began whispering in his sleep, names and sounds Margaret couldn't recognize, often in languages she didn't know. She told herself it was grief, manifesting in dreams. But here, in this new house, Ellis changed again. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He simply stared at the old house from the car window for a long, silent moment before stepping out. Margaret had hoped for a spark of excitement. Instead, she saw something cold and uncertain pass across his face. Not fear, something closer to familiarity. Like recognition. When shown his new bedroom, a modest room with east-facing windows and dusty curtains, Ellis turned away. He wandered instead to the stairs that led to the attic. He didn't try to go up, but stood beneath the low-hanging ceiling, staring at the trapdoor above. His gaze was long and unblinking, as if listening to something. Margaret called him away gently. He followed, but she noticed how often his eyes drifted back toward that door in the days that followed. The night after they moved in, the house settled with noises, soft creaks, distant knocks, the groaning of old beams. Margaret dismissed them as ordinary for such an old structure. But Ellis couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, burying his face into the blankets, trying to block out something that wasn't just sound, but scent. A smell had begun to seep through the ceiling, thick and foul, like something dead trapped behind the walls. Margaret climbed the attic stairs the next morning to investigate. The narrow steps were coated in dust, and spiderwebs clung to the banister like veins. The moment she opened the hatch, heat surged out like a breath. It wasn't just warm, it was suffocating. And the smell, it was as if flesh had spoiled in the dark for years. She barely stepped inside before slamming the door shut. The attic would have to wait. She tried airing out the bedroom, placing scented candles on every surface, but nothing helped. The odor was not constant, but it came in waves, strongest at night. She assured Ellis it would go away with time, but even she couldn't explain why it felt less like decay and more like something watching. Waiting. Unwilling to ignore the problem, Margaret called a cleaning service. 2 men arrived, friendly, professional, and equipped with industrial-grade supplies. They began with the downstairs rooms, complementing the house's architecture, despite its age. But everything changed the moment they climbed toward the attic. One of the men paused halfway up the stairs, his face draining of color. The other stood at the base, staring up in silence. When Margaret gestured for them to continue, they exchanged a look, an unspoken agreement. Politely but firmly, they declined to proceed. No explanation. No negotiation. Just a firm refusal, and a rapid packing up of their equipment. As they left, one of them muttered something vague about bad energy and residual trauma. He said he had felt it once before, in a manner that burned to the ground 2 weeks after he'd cleaned it. He claimed this one had the same weight. Margaret laughed nervously at the time, brushing it off. But when she returned to the house, the smell from the attic seemed even stronger. It wasn't just rotting. It was warning. The creaking started around midnight, slow, measured steps pacing directly above her head. Margaret would lie still in bed, every muscle tense, ears straining. The pattern never changed. 3 steps forward. Pause. 2 steps back. Pause. Then silence. Long, heavy silence, as if whatever was up there had stopped to listen as well. She told herself it was the house settling. Old wood shifting. Rodents, perhaps. But each night, the footsteps returned. Always the same rhythm. Always above her room. There was something calculated about the sound, too steady, too precise to be random. She once tried to convince herself it was Ellis walking around. But every time she checked, he was fast asleep, wrapped tightly under his blankets, his breathing soft and even. The attic trapdoor, just down the hallway, always remained shut. But she began to notice the chain latch swaying slightly in the mornings, even when there was no draft. Dust patterns around the hatch looked different too, as if disturbed from the inside. One night, she dared to place a small chair beneath the hatch and stood to listen closely. The footsteps stopped that night. Replaced instead by faint scratching, slow, deliberate, like nails dragged across wood. At first, Margaret thought the drawings were just a child's imagination reacting to the stress of the move. Crude sketches with black crayon, nothing unusual. But the frequency began to grow. Every day, a new page. Each one showing the same thing, a tall, lanky man standing in the small circular window of the attic. His proportions were distorted, too long in the arms, with a head just slightly tilted, like he was listening. What unsettled her most wasn't just the repetition, but the detail. Ellis had never drawn with such intensity before. He shaded the figure meticulously, even though the man had no face. Just a blank oval with thick, dark smudges where eyes should have been. The attic window was always the same, the way the light cut across it, the cracks in the glass, the blackness behind it. Margaret once asked where he had seen such a figure. Ellis didn't answer. Instead, he slipped another drawing beneath her door that night, with a message scribbled in shaky handwriting at the bottom, "He knows we're here." That was the first time she truly felt afraid, not just for herself, but for her son. The smell had grown stronger again, forcing her to open all the windows despite the chill outside. She decided to check the attic, convinced there had to be an animal infestation. She hadn't opened the hatch in over a week. The lock was intact, though covered in dust. As she climbed, her eyes caught something odd. One step below the hatch bore a muddy print. A full shoe print, pointed toward the attic door. It wasn't from her or Ellis. Too large, too deliberate. And the soil was still wet. As if someone had stepped there minutes before. She stared at the mark for a long time, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps one of the cleaners had gone up and forgotten to mention it. But that didn't make sense, they had refused. Had someone broken in? But the doors were always locked, the windows latched, and there were no signs of forced entry. She scrubbed the footprint away with shaking hands, but the feeling remained. The attic wasn't empty. It never had been. Margaret found him the first time around 3 a.m. The hallway was colder than usual, and she noticed the faint outline of a figure standing near the end, motionless in the dark. It was Ellis, in his pajamas, barefoot and still. His eyes were open, but glassy and vacant. He stood directly beneath the attic hatch, staring upward, arms limp by his sides. She guided him back to bed gently. He didn't resist, didn't speak. The next morning, he had no memory of it. But it happened again. And again. Always around the same time. Always stopping at the same spot. Once, she woke to the sound of soft humming. A low, tuneless hum that echoed up the stairs. She found him once more at the attic door, one hand stretched up, fingers grazing the latch. Margaret began locking her own bedroom at night, placing a chair beneath the knob, not to keep danger out, but to keep something within her home from finding its way too far. She stopped mentioning the attic at all. As if even speaking of it gave it more strength. It was on a cloudy morning when Margaret heard the cane tapping at the rusted front gate. Outside stood a woman she'd never seen before, wrapped in a thick shawl, her hair white and windswept. The woman didn't call out. She simply stood there, watching the house like it was a wounded animal. Margaret stepped outside, confused but curious. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Ashcombe. She had lived down the road since before Margaret was born. Her voice was gentle but firm. She didn't ask questions. She didn't exchange pleasantries. Instead, she told Margaret what few dared to say, that house was different. That time didn't move the same within its walls. That grief soaked the beams like rainwater, and once it knew your sorrow, it never let go. She refused to step past the iron gate. Her eyes darted toward the attic window. Then she muttered a final warning, that house remembers everything. And it never forgets who enters. With that, she turned and walked away without another word. Margaret stood frozen for a long time, staring back at the windows, wondering what, if anything, was staring down at her from the attic beyond. The dreams began subtly. A creak, a whisper, a presence. But soon, they intensified into vivid, paralyzing nightmares. Margaret found herself standing in the middle of the attic, though she had no memory of climbing the stairs. The air in the dreams was thick, almost wet, as if she were submerged. The light from the attic's single bulb swayed unnaturally, casting long shadows that danced on the warped wooden walls. He was always there. Not moving. Not speaking. Just standing at the far end of the attic, by the small, circular window. The man had no features, his face a blur of smoke, but his presence impossibly real. Margaret felt him watching her, not just with eyes, but with something deeper, something that pierced through skin and bone. In the dreams, she couldn't move. Her feet stuck to the floor as if nailed down. She could only watch as the faceless figure tilted its head slowly to the side. Then the dream would always end the same way, with her heart racing, her breath caught, and the distinct sensation of something just outside her bedroom door. Thistle had once been the most curious creature in the house, always chasing shadows, climbing shelves, squeezing into cabinets. But as days passed in the new home, her behavior shifted. Subtle at first, then undeniable. She stopped going upstairs altogether. Margaret noticed it when Thistle began waiting by the back door at dusk, meowing with insistence. Even during the frostbitten early winter mornings, the cat preferred the garden to the warmth of the second floor. She would arch her back violently if anyone tried to carry her toward the stairs, her eyes wide and terrified. Once, late at night, Margaret heard her yowling, low, guttural sounds echoing from the front porch. When she opened the door, Thistle darted inside, trembling. Her fur was bristled, her eyes locked on the attic window above. Margaret followed her gaze and saw nothing, just the dull outline of glass reflecting the moon. But Thistle stared for several minutes, unblinking. Then she bolted into the kitchen and hid behind the refrigerator, refusing to come out until morning. It started with coincidence, or what Margaret thought was coincidence. A casual mention of the attic while on the phone with her sister, and the living room light dimmed just slightly. Then, during dinner, Ellis accidentally spilled water over a drawing. He murmured something about making him angry, and the chandelier above them flickered 3 times before going out completely. Margaret replaced the bulbs. Checked the fuses. Hired an electrician who found nothing wrong. Yet the pattern remained. Any mention, spoken or written, of the man in the attic seemed to trigger the phenomenon. A lamp would buzz. A hallway light would burst. Shadows would shift, as though recoiling from the words. Margaret stopped speaking of the figure aloud. She began referring to the attic only in vague terms, but even then, the lights would pulse in warning. She realized the house didn't just remember, it was listening. It was Sunday, and the air felt heavier than usual. Margaret woke early, intending to clean the hallway, but something caught her eye immediately, the attic door. It was wide open. The metal latch dangled uselessly, swinging slightly despite the absence of a draft. The chair she had placed beneath the trapdoor had been pushed aside. Dust scattered across the floor showed unfamiliar footprints, long, narrow, heading downward. Ellis was still asleep. The cat was outside. No one else had keys or reason to climb into the attic, let alone descend silently in the middle of the night. A cold gust drifted from the opening above, carrying with it the faintest smell of soil and rust. Margaret climbed 3 steps and peered inside. The attic looked undisturbed, yet she felt a strong urge to back away, as if someone, or something, stood just beyond the shadows, unseen but present. She closed the hatch slowly, hand trembling, and replaced the chain. From that day forward, she began locking Ellis's door at night, not for his safety, but to prevent him from leaving his room. Margaret had been changing the sheets when she noticed it. A deep, uneven line beneath the bed frame. At first glance, it looked like a scratch. But as she crouched down and peered closer, her breath caught in her throat. Dozens of tiny symbols were etched into the wood. Some resembled twisted runes, others looked like malformed letters. They circled outward like a spiral, ending in a crude I drawn with sharp, overlapping strokes. The markings weren't random. They were intentional, arranged with a disturbing kind of precision. Margaret checked Ellis's hands, no cuts or ink. He claimed he hadn't seen them before. She flipped his mattress and cleaned the floor, but the next morning, more had appeared. Different shapes. Same spiral. Same eye. Whatever was in the house wasn't just watching, it was marking its territory. It started as murmurs. Barely audible at first, like the hum of wind against the walls. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew louder. Margaret would pause outside Ellis's room, uncertain whether he was praying, talking in his sleep, or answering someone she couldn't see. He always sat cross-legged on the floor, his back to the door, head tilted slightly toward the wall. Each night, the whispers began just minutes before midnight. The same cadence, the same tone, gentle at first, then increasingly urgent. When Margaret entered, Ellis would turn around slowly, blinking as if pulled from a trance, confused but unafraid. He never remembered what was said. He always insisted he had been asleep. Margaret stopped sleeping through the night. She began timing the whispers, recording them, but the tapes always turned up blank. Only the sound of static. Yet she could swear she heard a second voice under the hiss, deeper, rasping, not quite human. It was just after dusk when she noticed it. She passed the hallway mirror without a second thought, carrying laundry. But her reflection didn't move with her. It remained still for a fraction of a second longer, staring directly into her eyes long after she'd turned away. She froze. Margaret slowly turned back, her heart pounding. The glass was still. Her reflection now matched. But something inside her recoiled, an instinct older than reason. It wasn't just a trick of the light or fatigue. It was deliberate. Calculated. From then on, she avoided the hallway during twilight hours. But reflections began to distort elsewhere too, the oven door, window panes, even the black screen of the television when it was off. Sometimes, she saw the hallway behind her stretch impossibly far, flickering as if it led into something much older than the house itself. She began covering mirrors one by one. Curiosity led Margaret to the town's library. What started as a search for architectural records turned into a grim discovery buried in brittle newspaper clippings and faded maps. The property had once been part of the Ashbridge Sanatorium, a psychiatric asylum that burned to the ground in the late 1800s. Most of the patients perished in the fire. A handful escaped. But one, patient 43, was never recovered. The reports were vague, but disturbing. Patient 43 had been housed in solitary confinement after drawing the same strange symbols repeatedly on the walls of his cell, including a crude spiral with an eye at the center. He claimed something lived in the walls and whispered to him at night. The asylum ruins had been razed, and years later, the current house was built over the western wing of the original foundation. Margaret stopped reading after that. The sketches no longer depicted just the faceless man. They evolved into scenes that made Margaret's stomach churn, rooms with no doors, children chained to rusted beds, and black tendrils rising from the floor. The spiral symbol appeared in nearly every image, often at the center, radiating outward like a curse. One particular drawing showed the attic. But in Ellis's version, it was not empty. It was filled with people, twisted bodies stacked in corners, all with their mouths stitched shut. In the center stood the man with no face, his arms outstretched, strings tied to the ceiling as if he were a puppet or puppeteer. Ellis never remembered drawing them. At night, Margaret began locking away his sketchbook, only to find new pages filled by morning. For weeks, the basement door had remained jammed. Margaret had tried opening it once, only to find it sealed tight, the handle rusted into place. But that morning, as she passed it on her way to the kitchen, the door stood open. It hadn't just been unlocked, it looked as though someone had forced it open from the inside. The air that drifted up was cold and earthy, like wet stone. At the bottom of the stairs, past the old boiler, lay a tunnel carved into the rock, no lights, no wires, just damp walls and a slow descent into the dark. There was no record of a tunnel in the house's floor plan. Margaret stood there for several minutes, drawn in by something unexplainable. A pull. A pressure in the chest. Then came the sound, barely audible but undeniably real. A whisper from the tunnel, not in words, but in intent. It wanted her to come closer. The house was too quiet after midnight. Margaret's instincts woke her with a start, and she immediately felt something was wrong. Ellis wasn't in his bed. The sheets were cold. His window was shut. The entire upper floor seemed hollow in his absence. She searched the house in growing panic, every room more silent than the last, until her eyes fell on the open basement door. Her breath caught. The tunnel was still there, breathing cold air into the hall like a mouth left open. She hesitated only for a second before descending with a flashlight, heart hammering in her chest. At the base of the tunnel, just before the walls narrowed into deeper black, she found Ellis curled up against the stone floor, peaceful, as though sleeping in his own bed. His hands were dirty. One of them clutched a rusted iron key, old enough to belong in a museum. His clothes were damp. He was barefoot. Margaret took him upstairs, still trembling. He woke hours later with no memory of how he got there. Only one thing was clear, the key was not part of anything in the house. She had checked every lock. It belonged to something else. The new sketch was different. Precise. Measured. It looked like a cellar, but with strange proportions. A single chair in the center, chains on the wall, a small barred window near the ceiling. Ellis had drawn it obsessively for days, every corner, every angle. Margaret assumed it was just another product of his restless mind. Until she stood in the basement one morning and noticed a subtle outline beneath the crumbling plaster. Behind an old shelving unit, a square seam traced the wall like a forgotten doorway. Driven by dread and curiosity, she pried at it with a crowbar until the bricks gave way. Behind the false wall was the room. Exactly as Ellis had drawn it. The same rusted chains. The same iron chair. And in the corner, half covered in dirt and bone dust, was a heavy door with no knob, just a slot for a key. The rust matched the one Ellis had found. Margaret hesitated before using the key. But something stronger than fear urged her forward. The key turned with effort, groaning like something that hadn't moved in decades. As the door creaked open, the air changed. It was thick, metallic, sour. Inside was darkness, deeper than the flashlight could penetrate. The walls were covered in carvings, not words, but symbols etched over and over again. Spirals. Eyes. Chains. An unfamiliar alphabet that seemed to shimmer when light touched it. Bones littered the edges of the room. Not animal bones. Human. Small. Children's. And at the center, a sunken pit, black and breathing, as though it were alive. The moment the door opened fully, the temperature dropped. Her flashlight flickered. Somewhere in the darkness, something moved, too fast to see, but loud enough to hear. She slammed the door shut, hands shaking, heart pounding. It began in the basement first, a patch of black that seeped through the concrete, oily and glistening, impossible to scrub away. Then it moved up the walls of the stairwell, creeping like veins under the wallpaper. Within days, the spiral began to take shape again, like a mark spreading its territory. One appeared in the living room. Another behind Ellis's bed. They weren't painted, just there. Like the house itself was bleeding them out. The air inside the house thickened. Margaret noticed the smell, sulfur and decay. Plants wilted overnight. Mirrors fogged without moisture. And at the center of it all, Ellis slept soundly, often smiling in his dreams. She tried to clean the walls. Paint wouldn't stick. Bleach bubbled on contact. The house no longer obeyed. The revelation came unexpectedly. Margaret had been too isolated to speak to neighbors until now. But curiosity, and desperation, drove her to ask about the house's past. Most shrugged it off, unwilling to talk. One old man, however, finally spoke. He remembered the last family that lived there. A young couple with a little girl. Friendly at first. But they changed. The girl stopped going to school. The parents boarded up the windows. Then, one day, the house was simply empty. No signs of struggle. No note. Cars still in the driveway. The lights were on. Authorities found nothing unusual, except a sealed wooden crate in the attic. A box with no hinges, wrapped in iron wire, with a single message etched into the lid. Do not open. It's still inside. The crate was never claimed. The house was cleaned and sold again. No one mentioned it to the next buyers. Margaret felt a sudden chill as she realized, the attic had been locked since the day they arrived. She had never opened it. It took 3 tries to force the attic door open. The air was heavier the higher she climbed, and the wood beneath her feet groaned like it remembered every footstep from before. The attic was a time capsule, sheets draped over furniture, yellowing papers, the stale scent of abandonment. And there it was. Pushed into the darkest corner beneath the slanted roof, half swallowed by old boxes and rags. The crate. Black wood, warped but unbroken, coiled in rusted iron wire, just as the old man described. Its surface was marked with old writing, carved by hand. Deep and deliberate. She recognized the spiral symbols again. The same ones bleeding through her walls. But it wasn't just a box. It vibrated. Margaret didn't hear the hum with her ears. It was something in her chest, behind her teeth, a low, pulsing energy that seemed to coil around her spine. She backed away, but her eyes stayed locked on it. Every instinct screamed to leave it alone. But the crate was waiting. The whispering started around 2 a.m. Margaret stood at Ellis's door, listening. At first, she thought he was dreaming. But as she pressed her ear against the wood, the sounds became clearer, names. Repeated softly, like a chant. Not names they knew. They were old-sounding, strange syllables mixed with something guttural. Some she barely caught, Elsbeth. Thomasin. Merrick. Alaric. The next morning, after Ellis woke up with no memory, she went down to the basement again. This time, she took a flashlight and forced herself to examine the walls closely. There they were. Dozens of names, carved into the stone. Scratched with something sharp. All around the edges of the ritual room. Names, dates, even short phrases in a language she couldn't identify. But every name Ellis had whispered, was there. Some were followed by a single word. Taken. The stain appeared beneath the crate first, a single drop of thick, black fluid that hadn't been there before. At first, Margaret thought it was sap or mold. But it didn't dry. It didn't spread like normal moisture. It pulsed. She tried to clean it. Paper towels disintegrated when touched. When she covered the crate with a tarp, the blackness soaked straight through it overnight. By the 3rd day, the stain had grown. It followed the wood grain outward, like veins spidering from a heart. It crept along the attic floor, stopped at the trapdoor, and pooled there, as if waiting to descend into the house. Something inside the crate was awakening. And it wanted out. She had no reason to look behind the beam. It was instinct. Or maybe it was the whisper, faint, but persistent, pulling her back into the attic during daylight. Behind a loose panel, she found a small cache, old papers, yellowed photographs, brittle letters. Among them was a faded black and white photo. A family. 2 parents, a girl, and a young boy. The boy was identical to Ellis. Same face. Same eyes. Same small scar above the brow he got from falling off his bike. But the photo was dated 1947. Margaret felt her knees weaken. She clutched the photo, hands trembling, mind spiraling. This wasn't reincarnation. It wasn't a coincidence. This house had known Ellis before. And it had brought him back. She couldn't take it anymore. The whispers. The stains. The impossible photo. Margaret packed their bags in silence, picked up the still sleepy Ellis, and drove without a destination, just away. The road was clear. The GPS was off. She followed the path through the forest toward the highway. Then, the trees began to blur. Every bend in the road felt familiar. The curve of the stone wall. The leaning mailbox. After 20 minutes, she saw it. Her own house gate. She tried again. A different route. Again, and again. Every road curved back to the same driveway. The house refused to let them go. At first, it was subtle. Margaret would turn into the upstairs hallway and pause, sensing something off. A door that used to lead to the linen closet now revealed a staircase descending into darkness. The hallway seemed longer, impossibly long. She began leaving her phone's flashlight on just to navigate. She marked the doors with chalk, trying to confirm her suspicion. But the next day, the marks were gone, and in their place were crude drawings, childlike stick figures, eyes hollow, hands reaching outward. She walked through what should have been the pantry and emerged in a cold stone hallway that didn't exist on any blueprint. The walls were wet with condensation, lined with rusted hooks and crumbling portraits of strangers who looked like they were watching her. Sometimes the rooms were still there, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, but they'd shift locations, angles, even windows. One night, Ellis's bedroom disappeared entirely, replaced by a narrow closet filled with doll heads and scorched hymnals. The house was no longer a structure. It was a being. And it was growing. Margaret found his notebook under the bed. Ellis had filled page after page with drawings, shaky lines, rough shading, frantic scrawls. All of them were of the house, drawn from every angle. But there was something off. The windows were always eyes. The front door, a gaping mouth. Shingles turned to jagged teeth. Chimneys like horns. And from the roof, strange tendrils hung like limp hair. The more she flipped through the pages, the more human the house became. The last pages were the most disturbing. He had drawn the house again and again, but now it stood on legs, massive, distorted limbs, rooted into the earth. In one drawing, it was crawling. In another, it was feeding. One sketch showed the house devouring a smaller home, absorbing it. On the back cover, Ellis had written something. "It's wearing a skin. But I know what it is." Driven by desperation, Margaret set up her old DSLR on a tripod in the attic, aimed squarely at the crate. She activated motion detection, unsure if she'd catch anything at all. The next morning, the file was waiting. The footage began uneventfully, stillness, flickers of dust, a shifting shadow from the moon outside. Then, precisely at 3:12 a.m., the crate moved. The lid rose a fraction of an inch. Just enough to expose a sliver of blackness inside. It held there. And then it breathed. Not air. But movement. A rhythm. A pulse that pushed dust outward in a circle around it. And from within, a vapor crept out, dark, almost invisible, curling into the air like a hand. The camera lens fogged for 3 frames. When it cleared, something was pressed to the inside of the lens. A face. Not human. Not animal. And then it was gone. Margaret hadn't spoken to the neighbors much since moving in. But after weeks of the unexplainable, she approached an old woman who often sat silently on her porch across the road. The woman didn't look surprised. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the attic window. She said the town used to send people up there, not police, not clergy, but men in suits. In 1950, there had been an incident. People vanished. Whole families. The house was sealed off. Marked with black paint. Local children were warned to never go near. Then one day, the markings were gone, the history buried. The county reclaimed the property and sold it quietly decades later. Margaret asked for records. "There are none," the woman said. "They were all burned." The town wanted to forget. But the house remembered. It happened in an instant. Margaret turned her back for a second, to fold a blanket, to adjust the light, and Ellis was gone. His toys were still warm. The door hadn't opened. The windows were locked. But his presence was gone, like breath exhaled into the void. She searched for hours, screaming his name. Then came the voice. It echoed from the fireplace. Then from the kitchen sink. Then from behind the walls, beneath the floorboards. Ellis's voice, but not quite right. It was stretched, slowed, deepened in places. And he wasn't calling for her. He was calling her Elsbeth. The same name carved beside the word taken in the basement wall. She dropped to her knees, clutching the photo she'd found. The one where Ellis had already lived and died. And for the first time, Margaret began to understand. This house had claimed him once before. And it was doing it again. The air had grown thick, like syrup that clung to her lungs. Every surface of the house now throbbed subtly, like flesh with a hidden pulse. Wallpaper peeled in rhythmic waves, and even the silence between sounds had a tempo, like a living organism regulating its breath. Margaret moved cautiously, afraid to touch anything. As she walked past the hallway mirror, she didn't see herself, but rather, a younger version of her, crying at a funeral, holding a closed casket photo. The reflection flickered, replaced with a memory she never recalled living. A different funeral. A different child. Every room she entered now brought back something deeply buried, memories she thought lost, traumas she never experienced. The house was dredging grief from her soul like a fisherman hauling netfuls of rot from the ocean floor. It wasn't just haunted. It was feeding. And she had brought it a feast. Margaret had no plan, only instinct and terror. She dragged the crate into the backyard at dusk, doused it in lighter fluid, and set it ablaze. For a moment, the fire roared with unnatural vigor, burning green and blue, casting sickly shadows against the trees. But the crate didn't turn to ash. It split open from within. Out spilled not contents, but a crawling mass of vapor, cold, slow-moving, sentient. It slithered back toward the house like it belonged, like it had roots there. She tried to stop it, stomp it, even speak to it, but her voice turned to dust in her throat. The entity didn't fear the flame. It had seen fire before. It was older than fire. And the house welcomed it home. She hadn't returned to the basement since the first night, but something drew her back. The deeper she descended, the colder the air grew, not a natural cold, but the chill of absence, of hollowed time. By flashlight, she studied the wall again. There was Ellis's name, still etched below the word taken. But beneath it, another carving had appeared, half buried beneath flaking concrete. Her name. Margaret Elsbeth Hargrove. The date beside it read October 12, 1955. 70 years ago to the day. It didn't make sense. She hadn't been born yet. But the carving was real. Freshly unearthed. Her fingers trembled as she touched it, and in that instant, she felt the ground lurch below her feet, as if time itself hiccuped, remembered her, then resumed. It wasn't just Ellis the house wanted. It had always been her. It was like stepping into a painting whose brushstrokes refused to stay still. The moment the grandfather clock struck 3:33 a.m., all the clocks in the house stopped, frozen mid-tick, mid-chime. Margaret ran from room to room, trying to will them to move again, but time had unraveled. Each window now opened to a different world. One showed winter, with thick snow blanketing a graveyard that didn't exist nearby. Another glowed with summer sun, but in it, she saw herself gardening with a man she didn't know, his face too blurred to remember. A third showed fire consuming a nursery room that had never existed upstairs. She slammed them shut, but they wouldn't close. The glass turned to water under her touch. And in each reflection, Margaret looked different, older, younger, distorted. In one, she was no longer human. The house had broken time. And with time broken, anything could enter. Or escape. She stood frozen, at the top of the staircase she had climbed countless times. But this time, something felt final. The banister pulsed like a vein beneath her grip. The stairs seemed longer than before, twisted, impossible, as if descending into the belly of something alive. From below came a voice. Soft. Familiar. Her own. Whispering. Welcome back, Elsbeth. The name echoed upward, curling into her ears like smoke, like a lullaby. She didn't remember ever being called that. And yet, every bone in her body responded to it. The camera pans back. The house, in its entirety, breathes once. A low, groaning inhale. Lights flicker across the windows like eyes adjusting to the dark. And then, cut to black. A single heartbeat plays over the credits. Margaret was never just moving in. She was returning. That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you, if you still dare to watch next time.